it's because of the cross, because of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, because we allowed him to come and turn our tears into a testimony, our pain, our troubles. And tonight we're doing that. So let's go ahead and open it up in prayer and just allow the Spirit to move and speak through our brother Paul. Dear Father God, we come to you in prayer tonight to thank you so much, Father God. Thank you for this night of being to testify of the God, the good Father that you are, Father. And that we can't do nothing without Jesus, Father. You are a way maker, a miracle worker, a God who restores hearts, lives, brokenness, who heals, who pulls us out of the darkness, Father God, who lifts us up when we feel stuck. You're a good Father. I want to pray a blessing over my brother Paul as he gives his testimony, Father God, of how you worked in his life, Father. And how now the angels rejoice along with you, Father, because he is a living testimony for you. I pray that you give him the words, Father, that you use them mightily, Father. Fill him up with your courage, Father God, as he shares his testimony with us tonight, Father. Let us open up our ears, our hearts, our souls, and just see how our setbacks sometimes can be the greatest comebacks, Father God. All this we pray and we lift up to you tonight, Father. In the mighty name of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. Amen and amen. Brother Paul. You're muted. Let me see. There you go.
All right. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for accepting to open it up and start it. Thank you for just wanting to share this, brother, wanting to be here. And I know that for those that don't know, about 2 years ago, Brother Paul shared his testimony, and he moved so many lives. And we hope that, it does it again, so thank you. Thank you for saying yes. It's all you, brother.
Okay. First off, I want to start just by saying a couple of things. My testimony is just to explain how powerful God really is and how he changed my life. The growing up in gangs and drugs and all that, I'm not saying my story to glorify it, because I'm so glad I'm not that person no more, but it was a part of who I was and who I became. And so with that, I'll go ahead and start. I was born in 1972. I'm 54 years old now. And I was born in Fullerton, California. And at that time, my family was really religious. I grew up religious. I remember, as a kid, going to Melody Land, which was over by Disneyland at the time. And it was like a big church, and, it was a big old, like, amusement park daycare for the kids. I remember seeing plays and, playing games and, coloring scriptures of, the Bible stories and things of that nature, It wasn't until I was, my mom got pregnant at 14, had me at 15, and I don't know what it was. My dad was young age or whatever, but, pretty much he got scared and ran off, didn't even really bother with my mom. And so my mom was raising me on her own at 15. And, at that year, her parents were real strict. My grandma's really religious, and they wanted to give me up for an adoption. So my mom had ran away, and then whatever happened where, they were all like, okay, they seen my mom's determination to raise me, and not give me up, that, they were like, all right, we'll deal with it, and, my mom, even single parent, even a single parent now, they struggle, it's not easy, and so my mom went through a lot, she got into drugs, at a young age too. And, I remember maybe 5 years old, she got married to my sister's dad. And at 5 years old, I just, you're still young, and I don't have really too much recollection of it. But, I just remembered, him being my dad, and, it wasn't until, later, that, cousins on that side of the family, we'd be like, well, he's not even your real dad, and they used to, tease me about it. And, I used to be like, what are you talking about, and so one time I brought it up to my mom, and she's like, well, why you say that? And I go, well, my cousins are saying, he's not my dad, and, at 5, they got married, and I started kindergarten, and, I had the last name of his last name, which is Gonzalez. And so to me, he was my dad, and, she's all like, well, no, Mio, he's not, and she kind of told me what happened with my dad, and so I was like, all right, whatever, he's not around, So at a young age, I started being teased and, not having a dad, as a kid, you take it to heart, And so I started just building up anger. I used to see my aunts and uncles with my cousins, and doing the family things, camping, and, the drive-in theater was big at that time. I remember always going in a big old station wagon or the pickup truck where you were able to ride in the back of the pickup truck. And, going with them, but I used to get jealous, or not even maybe jealous, like envious, like, man, that, just seeing how they were, and so I started just having a lot of anger in my heart, I would pick fights for no reason, just to release that anger, and it wasn't until maybe 8, I grew up, gang related, a lot of family members gang related, on my stepdad's side, on my real dad's side, on my mom's side, everybody was pretty much gang related, and, I remember growing up and watching my aunts and uncles kneel down, and they would put something to their face, as they're kneeling down. And, I would try to get closer and peek out what they were doing, just be a nosy kid. And, notice that they had a sock, and, just, all right, whatever, what they're doing, and it wasn't until one time when me and my cousins, we wanted to go to the liquor store, it was right down the street. And, we're going through drawers, looking in the sofa cushions, lifting up things to see if we could find some change, to go to the liquor store. And I opened one of the drawers and rumbling through it and came across a sock. It was all rolled up, and I looked at it and I was like, oh, so I put it to my mouth, kind of imitating what they would do, and I got this head change, my ears kind of, did a wah, 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 and I was like, whoa, so I was like, okay, so, I started doing that, I started going off to myself or with cousins, and we would try it out, and it went from that to glue and, just anything and everything, if there was something, I wanted to try it, and that was 8 years old. And at 8, I was in 3rd grade, and we ended up moving. Okay, and keep in mind, I'm probably gonna try not to lose you guys, but I'll probably bounce back and forth because that was my life.
Okay, brother. That's okay.
That was my life. I mean, I literally had 3 elementary schools that I went to, 3 junior highs, and 3 different high schools. And to me, I thought that was normal. When I hear people, live in one city pretty much their whole life, had 1 elementary, 1 junior high, and 1 high school. I was like, what? Like, you did what? But we moved around a lot. I grew up pretty poor. My mom trying to do it on her own. My stepdad was there, but he wasn't in the picture for long. By the time I was 10, he was already out of the picture. And, my mom was back on her own again, and, during this time, her mom had passed away as well. And my mom really took that to her heart, and that's probably when things turned for the worse, because she really got heavily into drugs. And, by 10, I was my own man. I was running the streets, doing what I want because my mom was half gone, didn't even know I was gone. Trying to take care of my sister because my sister was born, I'm 5 years older than her. And so, I'm 10, she's 5, and I'm trying to do my best, cooking eggs or whatever we had, make sure we ate, avocado burrito, man, that was like a delicacy, it was like, let me get an avocado burrito, let me get a hold of an avocado so I can make an avocado burrito, or a butter tortilla burrito, or even a bologna burrito, don't really care for bologna now these days, but, I still been knocking down avocado burritos for some reason. But, I did the way I can, to try to take care of my sister, and by 10, I was, that's the pretty much that last year my stepdad left. But during that time, he used to grow marijuana, and he had a greenhouse. And I remember just going back and, seeing what he would do and, watching him, and he would pluck his plants and, clean them and do all that. So, when he wasn't around, I'd go back there, grab a couple, take it to, my elementary school and, get rid of it. Found out, man, I could make some money, so I did that for a while. And, till it was a point where I had enough money where, once when you start growing up in that type of environment, you start meeting people in that same type of stuff, and then you start getting connections. And, I started found out, some, kids I kicked it with, their dad sold or something, and I'd be like, hey, well, how much can you get this for? And, so I started slinging at an early age, and, like I said, my mom, ended up finding a boyfriend, and, he was cool at first, just like pretty much anybody, at the start, and, he was in stock car racing. And I remember going to the Orange Show, to these races and stuff, and he was a pit manager. So, he would take me and, to the shop, and, I would help build the race car trailer or start helping working on cars, and I took a passion for it. I learned how to work on cars at an early age,
How old were you now?
By then I was 11, almost 12. And, he had buddies that would also race motocross. So, I started racing motocross, and I was really athletic as a kid. I had that going for me. I played sports growing up. Football was my passion, and so was baseball, And, at this time, I was still an average kid, I was still, doing my thing, but, between 10 and 12, he was real abusive, My mom would leave, he would hit her, and, he would take off for a day or two, then come back, and my mom would leave for a day or two, take us, we would go to my aunt's or someone, and then, he'd be calling, and, my mom would take him back, and this was an ongoing thing. That's why I was always going to different junior highs and high schools and stuff, because she was every time it happened, we would leave, and then we'd end up going back. And, it was just an ongoing situation. But during this time, between the time of her leaving and me always going back, I was 10. And I remember we're at my aunt's house, and I grew up in Pomona, it was Pomona, Rubidoux, and even Bloomington. I stayed in Bloomington for a while. I went to Bloomington Junior High for a little bit, but those were the areas because that's where we had family and stuff. And, my mom originally moved out of Orange County because I was born in Fullerton, and she originally moved us out of Orange County to get away from the gangs and the violence. She didn't want me, going that route, and so she tried to get me away from all that. And, going to Pomona at that time, it was crazy back then, And I remember, like I said, we didn't grow up with money, and my mom saved up, because I wanted those BMX bikes, the tricks one, where the whole steering handlebars can turn around without getting caught up, in the brake cable, and, because I like to do tricks and stunts and do all kinds of crazy stuff, and, I know she saved up for a while because, there were so many birthdays that, I was lucky if I even got a cake, and I remember this birthday was like one of the best, because she pulls out this BMX bike, and I mean, my eyes lit up. I was like, oh man, and I was just so happy. And I remember my uncles giving me a roll of quarters, and I was like, all right, cool, because I love to play video games. Out in Pomona, there was a market called Bonanza, and used to go there all the time, play Galaga. And my name would stay on that high score board forever, and every time I would go and it wasn't, because I'd play Galaga, Centipede, whatever ones that my high score wasn't on to get my high score on there. And I remember just, my birthday going with the roll of quarters. I was like, bet, sweet. I scored. I'm going Bonanza. And I was there for a while, I remember riding my bike through the field and getting there, putting my bike next to the arcade games, going, getting my candy, my bag of candy. I remember it was Jolly Ranchers, Now and Laters, and Lemon Heads, and Alexander the Grapes and Cherry Clans. Those were like my favorite. And, I just had a big old bag full of them. And then I used the rest of my quarters to start playing games. And I was probably there, I want to say maybe a couple hours, just playing until I got that high score. And I was like, okay, cool, got the high score, I'm out. And I went to go on my bike and noticed, man, I had a flat tire. I guess riding through the fields, it got those little thorns, those ones that have little picas all over around it. As I remember looking at the tire, and I pulled out a couple, and I was like, man, so I was like, all right. And as I'm walking out the store, this guy pulls a knife on me. He's all, give me your bike. My heart dropped, not because of the knife, because I mean, by this time I already seen a lot of stuff happening, with my aunts and uncles, and just fights breaking out and things that they did, busting beer bottles over fools' heads and just the violence around the family, That's why my mom kind of moved us out of it. But, so seeing the knife really didn't bother me. It was the fact that he's taking my bike. How am I going to explain that to my mom? My mom's going to kill me. She saved up, I'm dead, or I'm gonna be unalived, So I was like, man, so I was like, nah, I gave him my bag of candy. You could have that, gave him what was left of my quarters. You can have that. You ain't taking my bike. And he ended up swinging towards me and pulling the bike at the same time. So I let go as I'm jumping back, and he pops on the bike and he starts to ride, and he sees that it's flat. So he kind of hops off the bike and he looks back at me, and I'm just standing there, and he starts to walk off. So I'm like, all right, thinking, what can I do? Well, what am I going to do? And I'm looking around, and it must have been, I want to say maybe 2:30, 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And I remember seeing a construction truck, like maybe a pipe layer or something, because I remember seeing a bunch of pipes in the back of the bed, all used pipes. And I remember seeing one that had like a little elbow on it. So it looked like a little golf club with the little elbow on the end, those little quarter turns or whatever you want to call them. So I grabbed it and I kind of just laid it behind my leg. So in case he turned back again, he'd just see me standing there. And then I remember as soon as he turned the corner, I started running towards that corner. As soon as I got to the corner, I peeked around the corner to see where he was at, and he was still walking nonchalant. So I ended up creeping up on him. And I remember just swinging. And he must have heard me at the last minute running up on him because he turned around and he went to pull his knife. And I just remember swinging and I caught him in the back of the head and he fell down. And I hit him so hard I lost control of the pipe as well. But he lost the knife in the whole process. And I remember looking at him and looking at the knife and like my survival instincts just kicked in, you know. So I ran, grabbed the knife. And he see me grab the knife and he started to run, you know, with my bike. And, you know, as he's running, he kind of got tripped up on my bike. You know, the wheels kind of hit his leg. So he ended up dropping my bike. And, you know, behind Bonanza, there was a big old fence and there was like a field. And in that field, there was where someone would cut the chain links just to, you know, create a pathway, you know, because there was apartments on the other side where, you know, you could get the shortcut, you know, to get to market. And that's the way he was going to try to run. And that's the way I rode my bike through the field to get to the market. And, you know, but it was a waste. So he just decided to go jump the fence. And I was just so heated and mad that, you know, this guy took my bike that I ran after him, not thinking, you know, just ran after him. And I remember just having a knife in my hand. And as he's trying to go up the fence, I just took a swung and I ended up getting a pretty good chunk of his like leg part, you know, right below his butt and in between his like thigh or whatever. And I just remembered him screaming, you know, and it was kind of like those pig squeals, you know what I mean? And I remember just that sound sticking with me, you know, and he climbed up the fence and, you know, he dropped down to the other side and I seen him bounce off the floor and he picked himself up and started limping away. And I turn around and I see two fools grabbing my bike and throwing it in the back of their ranchero. Mm-hmm. And I was like, oh my God, not again. You know what I mean? So I was like, give me my bike. Mm-hmm. And they're all like, get in the car, youngster, you know? And I'm like, give me my bike. They're all, get in the car. I'm thinking they called the cops. And so I was like, oh shit, cops, you know? So I hopped in, you know, and I'm saying Cherry, you know, as a ranchero, you know, so I got one big old guy on the right of me, I'm Cherry, and the guy driving, you know, and, you know, as we're driving, he's all, I'll get you out of here, you know. He goes, but let me ask you something. I was like, what? He's all, why'd you stab that guy? I go, what do you mean? I didn't stab nobody. He's all like, started laughing. He's all like, no, why'd you stab him? He's all, we seen everything, you know. He's all, we seen you from the moment you walked out of the store and he took the bike from you. And, you know, we even took bets on whether you were going to do something about it or not. And he's all, by the way, I lost, you know, and, but I want to know why, you know. And I was all thinking about it, you know, and I was like, because he tried to take what was mine, you know. And to me, you know, like I said, growing up poor, so anything I got, I cherished. Right. You know, it was like, meant the world to me, you know what I mean? Because I was lucky to have it. You know, I would see family members, you know, with the new gaming system coming out, you know what I mean? And, you know, I would be lucky once they got the newer one, they would hand me down the older one, you know, and I'd be blessed with that, you know. But I always took a pride in my stuff I cherished, you know. And he's all like, all right, I seen him nodding his head, you know. And we ended up driving to this park, you know, and, you know, I remember, you know, him getting out and he's all like, come here, you know, walk with me, you know, let me talk to you for a bit. So we walked and there was a bunch of youngsters and a bunch of older guys and they were having a barbecue, you know, and just chilling out. And, you know, I was like, cool, man, you know, music was playing in the background and he's all, this is my hood. You know, he's all, this is, you know, where we kick back. He's all like, you know, where's your dad? I don't have a dad. He's all, well, where's your mom? I was like, I don't know, you know, I'm either at work or on the streets or I don't know, you know, like, and he's all like, you just out and about? And I'm like, yeah, you know, That's pretty much what I do. Just, I like going to the arcade, play games, and and he's all like, well, this is your family now. He's all, you're welcome here anytime, you want to get away. And, and I fell in love with that. I fell in love with that feeling of that family, like I would see it through, my cousins and stuff, but it's not the same, of having that in your own life, and, and I remember him calling his son over, which is a good homeboy of mine now, but called his son over and he's all like, hey, go grab the patches out of the garage and, fix the youngster's bike, and so I was there for a while, just chopping it up with them, and, I'd catch myself out, when I was bored or had nothing to do, just riding my bike to the park, see who was hanging out, and hanging, just hanging with them, and, there was a time though, my mom would go back again, so now I'm back again, over to the other city, and, I would leave whatever I had going on, behind, and I'd had to follow my mom, and, it was just rough, it was rough. And it got to the time where, I was already, I want to say 13 maybe, and he beat up my mom pretty good again. So we're back in Pomona again, and, I remember just going, hanging out with the homies again and just, getting into trouble, doing our things, and, during this time, I had, I remember going to a party one time and, usually at the backyard parties, something would always pop off, especially in Pomona, even on high school campus, and junior high campuses, there was always shootouts or something, and, a lot of gangs in Pomona didn't get along with each other. So if we played another high school or something, games wouldn't finish because, there would be something, a shootout or a fight in the stands, or even the football players, because a lot of them were gang related as well that played sports. And, but I remember, I don't know, I was 13 or so and, going back to Pomona and we were at a backyard and, this is the first time, I had someone pass away in my arms, and, just the sound, and the gargling of the blood and, used to stick with me, I remember, at times I'd have dreams, of just of me in situations like that, and I would just wake up in sweats, and I was like, all right, like, dang, but to me at the time it was just that lifestyle, and I had to do what I had to do, and but I don't know, I was 14 at one time, and I remember my mom, she ended up buying me a Firebird, and it didn't have any, 67 Firebird. That was my first car, and I remember by the time I was 14, she had gotten it, and I remember it didn't have an engine. So I would always go to work constructions, from early age, from like 12 and stuff, I would go work constructions during the summers when I was in Pomona, with my uncles or something, and I learned how to operate a backhoe and, a lot of the heavy equipment and, so I would work with him, and he would give me just a portion of it and keep the rest to, start buying parts so we could work, so on my off time when I wasn't working, I was helping them, work on the car to build the engine to put in it. And, life then was a little bit more exciting. We used to remember taking the backhoe in the backfields, and we would dig trenches and, have dirt clod fights or BB gun fights, with the whole neighborhood and just, be a kid, and, I started going to a high school, and my first high school was Rubidoux High School, and I played freshman football with them, and I was pretty good. I was one of the, you know, best defensive backs in the league. And, you know, the freshman team in Rubidoux was undefeated at that time, and, that was the highlight of my life, being on an undefeated team and, playing the sports and being the number one defensive back in the league was probably the highlight of my life. But then again, my mom's boyfriend, put hands on her again. And, I forgot to tell you, I was 10 one time when he put hands, and he ended up chasing me with a knife, and I thought that would be the deal breaker, that my mom would not go back. We left for a while, and I thought that would be the deal breaker, and he promised never to, do that again. And, but my mom would always go back, and, I understand now, because I seen it a lot throughout the family. There were some abusive family members, that I seen go on, and, the love, I guess, they had for them, is just, or I don't know, let them put up with it, but, she would go back, and I thought that was the deal breaker, him chasing me with a knife and threatening me, but no. Anyways, when, I was 14, that was probably the last one where he put hands on her, and we didn't end up going back, and so I was now pretty much growing up in Pomona. And my first high school there was Gary High School, which is on the south side, which was, where my neighborhood's from. And, went there probably a half semester, and then, I was staying with my aunt at the time. We lived off of, South Power Street. And, we ended up moving to the opposite side of town. So I went to Ganesha High School. And there, I had a lot of enemies, and, I would constantly be getting in fights, and, I have hands, I grew up tough, and I could sling them, so, pretty much every fight I was in, I would be knocking fools out. And, so my reputation for slinging them was now known, and so a lot of times, people would just puff, and puff, and then nothing would happen, but, I started, besides selling weed, I ended up, selling guns as well. And so I always come across gun shipments, I was probably 12 at the time when I started, but by the time I was 14, I was really involved. And, I would, sell to cousins in Orange County, and, provide them for, stuff for their neighborhood. And, I was making pretty good money. And, I was working at the time too. I was working for 7-Eleven. So, I was always taught, keep a job, you could do your hustles on the side, but keep a job. That way, if you ever get busted with a bunch of money, you got your job to back it up, so I always made sure. And not only that, my work ethic was strong, like I said, since I was 10, 11, going to construction, I even had a paper route at an early age where, I used to wake up 4:30 in the morning, bundle papers and go on my bike and just toss them to the local neighborhood, and before I went to school. And, so my work ethic was strong, and, but, going to school where you get a bunch of rivals, I would always go to school strapped, and one thing we learned at an early age too was how to shoot. My uncles were in the military, and, we would go to Lido Creek, or when we would go camping, they would take the guns and we would shoot rifles and shotguns and handguns and, just have fun, target practicing on cans and, things. And so I learned how to shoot too. And, I was a pretty good shot, I wasn't those ones that would just shoot in the air, I would actually run you down, and aim. And, so I had a reputation at an early age on the street, and but that reputation got me in a lot of trouble, And like I said, just the anger I had, growing up without a dad, I would pick fights just to pick them, you know what I mean? Just to, someone looking at me the wrong way, like I had that attitude, who you mad dogging, and just, and most of the times it would be someone just like trying to recognize me because, they know me from somewhere, and to me, I would always take things the wrong way, like, assume something, but it was always the worst. And, so, I would always go strapped, and, it got to the point where I'd get suspended a lot, and I'd get in trouble. My mom would find out and had to go to school, and, just, my whole thing, even though my mom was into drugs and all that, she did her best, and I commend her for that because there's not too many that can be a drug addict and still function and take care of the family, Some get just so involved that the family gets neglected, but, she managed, she would still work sometimes, and do what she could, but, so, I remember, I was 14 and, I would go to school strapped, and I remember this kid I fought at the beginning of the semester, he was all trying to show off in front of some girl, and I just went in, picked a seat, and he sat there for a while, for that first semester. And then he came back, when his suspension or expulsion, whatever it was over. And, he claimed I was sitting in his seat, and I'm like, man, I've been sitting here for a while already. This is my seat, and, he got in my face and, so I ended up just knocking him out, and I ended up getting suspended for a while. And, some stuff was happening on school where, there was a guy that came out YA from one of my enemy's hoods. And, for the most part, I was just fighting these guys, and, they always knew I was strapped. So they always just wanted to fight, so I'd be like, all right, I'd pass my homies my gun, and just go down, because, I only used it if I had to, I wasn't the type to pull it and just start shooting, because back then, your fist was your main way of getting respect, but I had it just because everybody else was strapped. And if, to me, I had that mentality, it's me or them, and so, I remember hearing, this girl I was kind of just dating at the time. One of her girlfriends was, I guess, a girlfriend of one of the guys from my enemy's neighborhood. And she came telling my girl, the girl I was seeing that, hey, they're going to get him, they're going to get him after school, And so she came crying, telling me just to go home, that they're going to get me, just leave now, and after school that they were all coming. And to me, I had that pride, like, nah, let them come, So first thing I do is I went to my locker and I went and grabbed my strap. And I remember the guy that I put hands on, he had a locker, a couple of things down. And I remember just looking over, he looked at me as I'm putting my strap in my waistband, and he kind of turned real quick, like, he didn't see me, And I didn't think nothing of it. I just thought the fool was being nosy, and, got scared when I seen him. So he just, looked the other way. So I ended up going to my 5th period class. And next thing you know, police knock on the door. And it's one of those trailer type classrooms, and, I seen the police, and I see them talking to the teacher. And all of a sudden I hear my name, Paul Gonzalez. I was like, gosh, man. So I'm like, man. So my heart just dropped, and sure enough, I stepped up and they told me to come here. And as he grabbed me, he threw me against the wall. And when he threw me against the wall, my strap slipped down my pant leg and hit the floor. And the floors are hollow, so because they have the wheels underneath, so it made like a big old thump. And next thing you know, they slammed me to the floor real quick. I had a gun in the back of my head, and they're all like, don't move. And they ended up cuffing me up. Well, I remember being cuffed, and as I'm walking out, I see that one fool that I put hands on that, I beat up at the beginning of the school year. And, I seen them talking to the principal and one of the sergeants. And I seen him kind of shake his head like, yeah. And I was like, man. So I ended up going to juvenile hall, and, I was doing in juvenile hall for a while, and, I ran into one of my homies, and, he seen me, and he was like, hey, fool, and back then I think there was only maybe two of us in there. And in juvenile hall, it was still gang related. You'd get in fights with your rivals in there, and it wasn't like it was in county jail or prison. Where you had to get along with the same, whether you're enemy or not. So it was a little bit different rules. So I was getting in fights and stuff in there, and keep in mind, like, my mom didn't know, I was in gangs. I tried to keep that from her. I mean, I'm granted she wasn't dumb, because sometimes homies would come over, and they all choloed out, you know what I mean? And, I'd be like, hey, mom, this is my friend, and, and she'd be like, oh, hey, my mom would always be that type, whatever it was, whether it was a bologna sandwich or something, she'd make sandwiches, and here, would feed everybody that would come over, and that's just how my mom was, and she got to the point where some of my homies would be calling her mom too, because that's just how she took care, and, but, I tried to do my best, living basically two different lives, because when I got busted, it was a shocker to everybody, and keep in mind, I did a lot of dirt in between then, I mean? I was just careful on how I did it, and, and,
How long were you in juvie?
I was in juvie. I ended up doing like 8 months, I want to say. I think it was 8 months. I took some GED classes and stuff at the time, and, but while I was in juvie, it was the first time I met my actual dad, I was 14, and my mom, it was Father's Day. And I remember my mom coming to me and saying, hey, your dad wants to meet you. And at first I was like, that fool ain't got nothing to do with me, all of a sudden he wants to show up. I'm already 14, and by then, like I said, at 10, I was my own man. I had that attitude, like, I'm taking care of my sister, ain't nobody going to tell me what to do, especially a male figure, you know what I mean? And so, I was like, you know what, all right. Something in my heart told me, you know what, all right, I'll give him that. And, I ended up meeting him, and, I remember he had this graspy voice, kind of like the Godfather, And, my dad's well known as well, he's really well known, and because he's all his life incarcerated. And, I met him, talked to him, and he's all like, you know what? I know I ain't got no right to tell you to come in your life, and try to be a father to you, but he's all like, I want to get to know you, So I'm like, you know what? You're right. You ain't got no right, but, I'll be here, And I remember when I got out of juvie, he was already busted again, and he already violated. So I remember going to Chino and visiting him, and, visiting him and be like, all right, and he was going to do some time, so I was like, all right, whatever, it was nice to, that you made the effort or whatever, but whatever, and, I just, man, even after that, it seemed like the anger in me grew more, like, now you want to come in my life and now you're gone again, you're just teasing me, so, and I remember one time I was at a parking lot, or no, it was a red light, and I seen some guy just smacking on his girl, and for some reason, seeing my mom getting beat up and the bruises on her face just kicked in, and
Got triggers.
yeah, and I remember just putting my car in park and hopping out of the car and just pulling that fool out of the car and just knocking some sense into him, and I remember seeing that girl just hop from the passenger side, hopped in, didn't hesitate, hopped in the driver's seat and burned out. She ran through the red light and everything, and was gone. And, I hopped in my car and took off. And I remember looking in my rear view, seeing him kind of stumble, getting up, and from that reason on, man, every time I would see someone slapping their girlfriend or something, I would always get involved. And granted, most of the time I would have the female jumping on my back, like, leave him alone. And I'll be like, what? Like, he's whooping on you, and so I would get mad, and be like, whatever, you deserve it, but, as I grew older and thought about it now, I see a lot of them are fearful that, especially some guy putting hands on them and embarrassing them in front of the public, beating them up, even makes it worse, because when they get home, they even get a bigger beating, because, they didn't step in, so they figure if they do step in, like, well, I tried to get them off you, or, what I mean? They validate the reason or something, I don't know what goes on, but.
The other thing that, to see it too, Paul, when, you're showing them, that's not right, because again, it's something that triggered you that you saw when you were young, that was being done to your mom. Regardless, sometimes we don't stop and think and that this is also makes them feel like less. So it's instead they know the girl knows that she's gonna get it worse because you did that. You see what I'm saying? It's like what you made him feel like he couldn't handle it. You know what I mean?
Right.
He can beat it on a woman, but he can't beat it on a man. In other words, so yeah.
Right.
Well done.
Yeah. So, I had that little stage in me, where I was just getting involved in any little situation I seen, and but and then I remember when I got out, I was expelled from the district, so I had to go to a probation school. And it was nothing but probation officers were the teachers. And, then too, I didn't last too long there because I ended up, getting in a fight with an enemy. They had a pool table upstairs, and I remember he tried to throw a pool ball at me. So I grabbed a pew stick and I cracked him over the head with it. And I ended up picking him up and throwing him over the balcony, and he landed on the desk below us. And as soon as they seen him hit the desk, they rushed up there, and, with taser guns and, pepper spray and handcuffs just coming up, and, luckily no one ratted me out, but, I ended up just getting into more trouble in the probation school where I ended up getting kicked out as well. And, but I remember one time I was sitting at home and hear a knock at the door. Open the door. Lo and behold, the guy, my mom's ex, that used to put hands on me. As soon as I seen him, I slammed the door, and he put his foot in the door, and he's like, "Where's your mom?" And I was like, "What are you doing here? How'd you know where to find it? How'd you get here? You need to leave." He's all like, "No, I need to talk to your mom." I was like, "No, you don't. She's not here, just go." And he kind of forced his way in a little bit, and so I was like, "All right, go ahead and sit on the sofa, she'll probably be back in a bit, And he sat on the sofa, and I went to my room, and there's my strap sitting right there, and there was a bat. I kind of reached for the strap, and I was like, no. Something in my heart told me no. I grabbed my bat, and I went back out there, and as soon as I seen it, I just cracked him in the back of the head. He rolled on the floor from the sofa, and he tried to get up, and I remember just taking my swings and hearing from the aluminum bat, hearing the think, think, think as I'm hitting parts of his bones and body, And I hit him so hard, he hit the wall, and I guess my mom was at the neighbors because she was real friends with the neighbors, and but I guess a picture frame or something knocked off the wall, and I think maybe she thought me and my sister or something were roughhousing or going at it or something. But I remember just swinging, just releasing this anger I had in me, not thinking about anything, just, I wanted him to hurt, and I remember seeing the door open and the light shine through the wall that he's on, and as I'm going to swing again, I feel this tug, and I'm thinking, oh man, I hit my mom or hit my sister. Those are the only two that would be in the house, and I see my mom and she got tears running down her eyes, and she's all like, Mijo, what you doing, and I kind of snapped out a little bit. I dropped the bat from where I'm thinking I swung back and I hit one of my family members. I had dropped it, and by this time this fool's laid out. And I remember just dragging him out of the house and leaving him outside the door and closing the door and locking it. And I'm telling my mom, how did he get here? How did he know? And she's all like, I'm sorry. I wrote him a letter, and she put the return address, and so he ended up showing up, And by this time, I was involved with, a couple of homies from different neighborhoods that lived in the apartment complex, and, they must have heard what was going on and seen this fool. So knowing that something happened between me and him, they're like escorted this fool off the property, And I call up the homies and I was like, hey, I didn't get to finish this, but I know he's probably rode the bus or or he's at the bus station or the train station, and they're all like, don't trip, we got you, And I remember, a few days later, them saying we took care of it for you. I was like, just a relief, they never told me what they did, but I know I never seen them since, you know what I mean? And, but, I just remember, crying, Lord, help me, where's this coming from, help me, and, I know he was always there, because I was in situations where the only explanation was him, I used to, like I said, I used to sell drugs and guns, and, when you're involved in stuff like that, there's always someone out to come up, someone out to, try to take your stash, or, what I mean? And it happened to me one time, and I was on my knees and had one put in my mouth, and I remember just saying to myself, please God, may the blood, because I was always told, say, may the blood of Jesus protect you, and I remember saying in my mind, may the blood of Jesus protect me, may the blood of Jesus protect me. I don't want to die. I don't want to be unalive, And I remember hearing the click, and as soon as I heard that, my survival instincts kicked in. I grabbed it, and we're tussling, and I'm swinging and just swinging for my life, to hitting him as hard as I could, and wrestling for the strap, and it ended up being in my hands. And I remember him seeing I have it, so now he's running out the door, and my first instinct was to pull the trigger. And lo and behold, I pulled the trigger and I hear the poof, and it hit the door. I seen the wood chip from the door panel where he's leaving, And I just remember, man, going home, couldn't sleep the whole night, and just thanking the Lord, just thank you, God, thank you,
How old were you when this happened?
I was 16.
16 now?
It was right after, all this happened, and, I did my time in juvie and I got out, I still was running amok, got out of probation school and still doing my thing, And
was this at 16? Did you know if that was the first time that you actually cried out to God?
No, I used to before, just situations where I was in, that was my first instinct, you know what I mean? And sometimes, maybe the situation could have been a lot worse than it was, but there was times where, I shouldn't be here, and I was, he saved my life numerous times. Like I said, I was always strapped. I was an active, I was known on the streets as active, and and growing up with that reputation, there's always like someone that wants to take your spot, or someone wanting to get you because you're the main one. You know what I mean? And if they take you out, they figure the rest is gonna crumble or something. And
It's a game, brother. Just trying to make a name for yourself.
yeah,
Trying to move up within the hood. Trying it's these survival instincts.
yeah, being selling and doing that and coming up with the cash. It always have deals on vests. So I always used to be vest up. You know what I mean? So there was times where I would get hit in the chest or the back. You know what I mean? And thank God that the vest stopped it. You know what I mean? I have still some scars underneath my armpit where one time I got hit with a shotgun, and I literally flew, I don't know, I want to say 15, 20 feet, and literally knocked out where they thought I was gone, and coming to, I don't know, it seemed like maybe 5 minutes, 7 minutes, of being just laid out, and coming to just this agony in my chest, and, but still, reaching for my strap and, seeing them still. So, just firing back and them taking off and, going back to my house and, looking, my chest was purple. The whole part,
or somebody
it was,
older.
yeah, it was older heads, that wanted to come up and, but I remember my chest being black, like, so black, and, I was one always, during the summer and stuff, my shirt off, I was a pretty built kid, so I used to like showing off my muscles, who didn't, back then, so I'd always be walking around with no shirt or whatever, and there was times where I would keep my, clothed up because I didn't want my family members to see, or secretive when I took my showers, but, I would never go to the hospital. And, I had, fractured some ribs, so even to this day, they don't heal right. I have trouble breathing sometimes, or, I turn certain ways and I could feel, the parts that are messed up, but, I went through 7 different vests,
This little quick thing, real quick. Keep this in the back of your mind. When it so happens to be your name, right? But when Paul is left with the thorn, in his side, kind of a reminder, and to keep him humble, to keep him humble. But we'll get there. Go ahead, brother. Just when you said that, it's just like the way God works. And there's some other stuff. Go ahead.
Yeah, he saved my life countless of times, and I'm grateful for that, and but I've still, it was in those times of need is when I reached out to him, and he would be there for me, and but I wouldn't think twice about it. I had that mindset where I was still, to me, oh, well, I had that attitude, like that gun, oh, well, I'm bulletproof, these fools can't take me. I'm still here, this is, I had that attitude, just because I was so active and doing things, and, but, at 16, I still got in trouble. I ended up getting busted for a robbery. And, I couldn't let my mom find out, And at that age, it was, they were trying to use the parents for minors, hold them responsible, And one of my homeboys his mom was my mom's name, same name, but different. The last name was spelled the first name was the same and the last name was spelled just with the Z. Ours is with an S, but it was Gonzalez. And I remember telling him, hey, they're trying to get me for this, you know what I mean? Can your mom come down, and try to get me out of this, and, she ended up going, it took her some things. She's all like, I'm doing this, because, my homie's dad was from the hood too. And he's the one that said, nah, you got to help the homie out, and so she, listened to him, and they did it, but, when they got me back to the house, they're all like, let this can't happen again. You need to, take care of this, and, lucky for me, there wasn't enough evidence, So all that ended up getting dropped, and, but they wanted me to, they kicked me out of the city. I was basically banned from Pomona. I couldn't, reside or live in Pomona, So I was like, great. How am I going to explain this to my mom? And, at 16, I started seeing some girl from Santa Ana, because we used to go party out there. We would cruise Bristol and Whittier and, so I ended up meeting someone out there, so I kind of used that as an excuse, like, hey, mom, I'm going to go stay with my, out there closer to, my girlfriend, and, and I go, not only that, part of me wanted to do it because my mom could concentrate on raising my sister. It was hard enough trying to raise both of us, and, I felt she would be able to concentrate on raising my sister a little bit better, I already had the means to take care of myself, I already had to hustle and, so I was like, I'll be able to manage, So I ended up living with my aunt for a little bit until I was able to get a place. And, but even then, I'm still running amok. I ended up buying a mobile home. My girlfriend's brother, we ended up getting a mobile home. Went half on it, and so I was like, all right, cool. And it was one of those 4-bedroom, double wide, 3-bath mobile homes. It was pretty decent, pretty cool, nice little complex in Santana. So I'm like, cool, and, at 18, she ended up getting pregnant, having my first kid. And, so I was kind of still doing my thing, and working, and trying.
18? Were you 18 as well now?
No, I wasn't quite 18. I was 17 when I bought the mobile home with her brother-in-law. Her brother-in-law was 23 at the time, I think.
So did you become a dad at 17 or at
18? At 18, I became a dad, and, but, we bought a mobile home so we could, have a place together, and, she ended up getting pregnant and had the kid at 18. And, so I'm like, all right, cool. That was my thing. I was always in love with having that family, and there was things I always promised myself, like, growing up, not having my dad and just having a stepdad and seeing how I was treated different, I made a promise to myself, if I ever have kids or I come across anybody that have kids, I'd never treat their kids any different than mine, I'd always try to treat them the same so they didn't have that thought or what I went through, the feelings, of feeling different, and, and then I made a promise now that I have kids, I'd never be my dad, I'm going to stick it out with them, and, that was my undoing, as I'm, we'll explain later, with what else happened in my life. But, there's, you put up with things, just because you want something in life, and, we ended up having another one, at 20, I had another one. So, my 2 oldest kids are a year and a half apart. First one at 18, and, 19 and a half or whatever when I had my second. And, was still involved in selling, weed and working, doing stuff on the side, I had kids now, so my main thing was trying to give my kids a life that I never had, and I used to spoil them. I wish they could see how I raised them at a younger age, because when I explain to you later, how things happened as they got into their teens, but I wish they seen that part of me, of me trying to be there and spoiling them, and I would go to jail a lot though, because I got tickets in Pomona when I had my Firebird for speeding. Well, when I came to Santa Ana, I never took care of those tickets, so I had warrants for my arrest. And, I'd end up going to jail, for the warrants. And, the first driving unsuspended I got, it was like 10 days automatically back then. I don't know what it is now, if they even let you get away with it now. But I remember my first driving unsuspended, I had to do 10 days mandatory. So I ended up doing 10 days in county, and so I'm like, whatever. My license got suspended, they took my car away, got impounded, So my routine was buy a bucket, go back to work, because I need to have a job, support my kids, So I was always, getting pulled over, losing my car again. And this would happen yearly. I mean, I want to say probably the first 8-9 years probably of my kids' life, I was probably busted every year for 10 days here, then it got to 30, 90, 3 months, 6 months, it was just a routine, and got to the point where I was on my 14th driving unsuspended, but to me, I didn't care, you ain't gonna keep me, sometimes I took the bus to get to work, if it was close enough, but sometimes I couldn't commute on the bus, so I would have to buy a bucket, and I would say, screw it, I'm gonna drive, get there, let them catch me when they can, Well, with my looks, by this time I was, already tatted down, baldy, and I would have cops do U-turns, what I mean, and they'll be like, man, I'm getting pulled over, and as soon as I'm getting pulled over, I'm like, I'm losing my job, I'm losing this car, I'm going to jail, And that was my routine for so long, And I really didn't pray much at that time, because to me, I already felt like I let him down so many times. How is he going to reach in and help me out this time? To me, I had that thought. It was like,
How old were you when that crossed your mind?
I was probably already a teenager, like 18, 19. When I started really going in and out, I was kind of...
When the thought of, what, you sent too far that he had given up on you.
That in my 19s, 20s, you know what I mean? Because by then, I've hurt so many people, and did so many stuff that, I was ashamed, and, to me back then, I heard certain sins were unforgivable, so that was my mindset. Like, he can never forgive me now, and, in my early 20s, going in and out and stuff, I used to have nightmares all the time of some stuff that I did, and, I remember one time I was out for a little bit and I went to a swap meet, and, it was like those guys that like the Botanicas or whatever, and as soon as he seen me, he started talking to me and telling me, he's all, you have nightmares that keep you up all night, huh? And I was like, what? That caught my eye, that caught my attention. I was like, how does this fool know, And he got a little deeper, and started mentioning, growing up without a dad, he mentioned anger, so I started paying closer attention to this guy, and he's all like, he's all, to get rid of those nightmares, you got to come to terms of what you've done, and I go, what do you mean? He's all, what you've done, you got to come to terms for what you've done, and, didn't think about it, but I remember it just sticking in my head, like how this guy knows so much, how was he so accurate, so dead on, and some people tell me, that that's bad stuff, and some, say that some is good, so, to me, I didn't know, but to me, I was just like, for him to know so much about me and be so accurate, like, and so I remember, like, what can I do, and I remember going to get my neck tatted, and on my neck I have a skull on each side, and I have like a rib cage that intertwines between the two. So the rib cage represents me, and the skulls represents, what I did in my past, and so every time I look in the mirror, I see them, and I know that, hey, what I did, and to me, I started having a remorse inside I couldn't explain. I would come to tears sometimes at night, and I start thinking of the family members that I hurt. I want to say this is probably the first time that I started getting a conscience, because I never had one. If you were in my circle, that's all that mattered. I looked out for you, and that's all that I cared about. If you were out of my circle, I could care less what you were going through, what happened. That was just my mindset. You ain't part of me. Then and I could be like that. I'm a Cancer. I could be so loving, and I could be so evil. It's just the way we were built. I guess. But this is the first time I remember me having a remorse and actually starting to feel guilty and saddened by what I'd done, and I took this opportunity, to just kind of get away from the hood, and kind of just focus on raising my kids and trying to be the best I could, and so now I was just pretty much just come ups, anything to make some easy cash, and and I was good at the stuff I did, I was strategic, at least I thought I was, and it wasn't until in my 18s when I had the mobile home, and my brother-in-law rented the unit out to one of his friends because he got kicked out of his pad, and I remember him coming to, he asked, hey, I got a friend that needs a place to stay for a little bit. He's only asking for like a month or so. He makes his own money, he'll be out. He just needs time to find a spot. I was like, yeah, whatever, that's cool. We had a spare bedroom, so, no problem. Well, I don't know. He wasn't even there a month, and he ended up getting busted, and he sold methamphetamine. I was selling weed at the time, and I remember just coming home, relaxing, and, next cops are at my door, and I'm all like, yeah, can I help you? And they're all like, mentioned his name, and I was like, yeah, but he's not here, And they're all like, I know he's been arrested. Is this his residence? I go, yeah, he has a room down the hall, And so I told him, you're welcome, to go over there, And so they went over, looked in his room, and then they started wanting to search the rest of the house. I was like, what are you doing? Where's your search warrant? And they're all like, oh, we just wanted to look in real quick to make sure, for our safety that no one's hiding or nothing, And I was like, all right, whatever. And then dawned on me, and forgot all about it, that I used my restroom as a little plant station. I had a weed plant growing out of my bathroom toilet, and it was nice and pretty fluffy and big, and I guess when he walked in to search the room, my bathroom door was open, and he seen the weed plant. So he comes back out, and he's all like, whose plant is that? And I was like, that's my room, and he made another call, and his partner came in, and next thing you know, I hear drawers rumbling, and I end up getting busted with 2.5 pounds of chronic. And so I'm like, great, getting busted for some other fool, because he made a mistake, And I remember going down to the substation and seeing this fool there, and I was like, what were you thinking, man? Like, and I remember just in the cell just going off on him. They had to come in and pepper sprayed the whole cell, and there's a couple other guys in there, that got it, but I remember, just beating the crap out of him because it was his fault, and he was trying to apologize, and so I ended up getting busted for possession for sales, and so I'm here I got bailed out, and I'm trying to fight the case. So I was fighting the case for quite some time. It wasn't until, I think I was like 19 where they ended up giving me a sentence. I got found guilty for it. And, because of, most of my stuff was driving unsuspended and nothing, they weren't looking at my minor record or nothing like that. It was pretty much, nothing big, So I ended up doing, 9 months, but, same thing, I got back out, still doing my stuff, and it wasn't probably until my early 20s, I want to say I was 21 maybe, and I started wanting to go back to the hood, like just I was missing that, even though I starting my own family, something was missing, and that pride started kicking in, like, nah, they ain't gonna kick me out of my neighborhood, what I mean? Like, and my kids, I remember my kids being in car seats, and my daughter I think was gonna be 3, my son maybe a year and a half or something, and they were in car seats, and I had a Caprice, Burger Green Caprice, and my car was known, in the hood, that's something, growing up in that lifestyle, you come to recognize who drives who, and, so, you can see your enemy coming, and, I wasn't even in town, a couple of days, and, word got around that I was in town, and, I remember going down one of the main streets in Pomona, and 2 cars cutting me off, broad daylight. And I don't know, maybe 3, 4 fools jump out of the car with AKs and just lit me up. Broad daylight, not caring, lit me up. And I remember my kids, I hit the floorboard, reached for my strap, opened the passenger door. The whole time, just, God, please don't let nothing happen to my kids. God, please don't let nothing happen to my kids. I remember just, looking underneath to see if I see foot's running up on me, because, the closer they get, the more my kids are going to be in danger, And I remember just laying off a bunch of shots. I probably let out the whole clip. Next thing you know, I hear cars taking off. I was froze probably a good couple of minutes, I want to say, not wanting to look into the car. And I remember looking up, seeing my daughter with her big old eyes, just looking what's going on, crying, And then I looked to see my son, and he was just nonchalant, not really. I don't know if he was asleep at the time, and, but there was glass all over the car seats, And I remember just trying to get out of there before the cops came, and went, dropped off my kids, and I was on a mission. I was on a mission. Even though after that, my first instincts was, oh no, how dare you come at me like that, with my kids. And the evil came out of me like nothing you've ever seen. Like, I was on such a mission. And I went and did what I had to do, And then I remember going back, I had to leave my car at one of my homeboys' pad for a while. his dad owned a body shop. He's all like, "Don't trip, we'll get your car to where it needs to be." He let me borrow one of his cars, and he's all like, "You know what? Just get out of here for a while." He's all, "Let things cool off, and we'll handle this. We'll take care of it." And I remember just grabbing my kids and going back to Orange County and not telling anybody anything. Keeping it a secret. The only ones that knew were, my homies that I told, not even everybody, all the homies, just a couple that I was tight with, because, thing growing up in that neighborhoods, you could be, 200-300 deep, but there's only maybe 4 solid ones that you have your own little crew that you do everything with, that you could trust, that in case something did go down, it's only you 4 that knew. So, it's one of you 3, that told on me, So that's just the way I worked, I didn't involve too many people in the stuff I did. And that's kind of what let me get away with a lot that I did as well, But I remember just going back to Orange County. And again, just what am I doing? My pride. I'm letting my pride take a hold of me, I got kids now, they could have they could not be here right now, And so that kind of woke me up. I was like, what, forget that. I'm going to stay away, try to raise my kids the best I can, do what I can, But, started getting involved in selling other things, started selling meth because that was the money maker. Well, me and my kids' mom started using. At first, I always was taught, don't get high on your own supply, that's how you're going to make your money, but, just things were happening in my life where I wasn't happy, I wasn't happy with the person I was with, I was happy that, hey, I have a family, I'm trying to do my best to raise them, I'm trying to give them a life that I didn't have, having a mother and a dad with, that are in the same household, but there's other stuff going on along that, I put up with just because, and it made me start thinking about how my mom was abused. Started thinking about the women I see that got abused. And now I could kind of relate to why they put up with things just to stick around, And so to me, I was cool with that. I'll be unhappy, as long as my kids got their mom and dad, thinking that that's what was needed, But it got to the point where we were so far in our drugs that it was causing a problem, 21, my dad got out again, started coming around. So I was like, cool, I was still partying, doing my thing, started getting high with him, started doing things with him that we shouldn't be doing, like he was one of my homies, It was a little different though, I didn't have the respect for him as a father. It was more had the respect because he was a homie and he was a well-known homie, So to me, growing up like that, he earned my respect as being someone well-known, I give him that respect. But as my father, nah, he had nothing coming, But it was cool, started, hanging out, having barbecues, playing horseshoes. And to me, it was like, all right, I got him back in my life, It may not be how I wanted, but he's here, And it was starting to get a pretty good bond, But then, started getting my addiction again, real bad. And to where I'd get paranoid sometimes, and you start thinking things and, it started pulling things, it was cool because it was him and my brother, I have 3 other brothers, and these are ones that I didn't grow up with, but when my dad was around, it started happening, and they were being part of my life. And, so it was good for a while, and then we stopped kind of hanging out again, and went our own ways. We were all doing things, and so we all got just in our own confusion and our own dilemmas, and and but it got to the point where I was like, I started seeing what I was doing to the kids. I was neglecting them. I wasn't being that father that I could be to them. I would be locked up in my room and, not really caring, I mean, my mom did more of a better job as a nag than I did, and I started looking at it like that, like, like, man, what am I doing, So I told her, my kid's mom, like, what, that's it, let's get sober, And she told me, I don't got a problem. I could quit anytime, And I was like, well, I need you to quit, I can't quit if you don't quit. How can I be around you, and you doing it? And, I mean, it's going to make me want to keep doing it. And, so I ended up separating from her, and I was still doing bad. So I mean, the kids had a house, a roof over their head. I was like, what am I going to do? I had to go stay with my sister for a little bit, and, it was cool for a while, we were still, share weekends with the kids, I'd get my weekend and, we were trying to co-parent and do that thing, and, it was cool for a while, and then she started dating someone. It was my kid's basketball coach, she started dating him. And so I was like, all right, cool, whatever, and, so I was like, it took me a while, I was just focusing on trying to get my life back on track, and I was still selling and trying to come up. I started working construction, and, me and my sister ended up getting an apartment together. And it was cool, spending time with my sister, I missed her, and we're, started spending some time.
Why did she come back into your life?
Well, my sister was always around. I would go visit my parents, my mom. My mom ended up moving back to Orange County shortly after I did, probably when I was 17, 18, just to, get out of Pomona and try to be closer out towards where I was, and I know she was working out that way at the time, so it was easier, but in that time, when she moved out, my sister ended up getting involved too in gangs in Buena Park, and so she, but I would still go on weekends or whatever, any, family parties, stuff like that. I mean, I wasn't like I, didn't see my family. We were always, family functions or birthdays or, things like that. My family was still around, but, I was more focused on just my thing, and that's how I always been, just trying to focus on me and what I have, my little circle, and that's what, makes me happy, and so, got a place with my sister, and then I started seeing someone, and that's when things went for the worse. I don't know if she was jealous or still wanted to thought we would get back or whatever, but it was crazy. It's like I had no problem with her seeing someone, but the minute she heard I was seeing someone, now, I couldn't pick up my kids for that weekend, or, she would do shady stuff like give one of her brothers money to take my kids to Disneyland or Knott's Berry Farm or somewhere fun, where, they'd be like, oh, Dad, Uncle's going to take us to, Knott's or Disney, can we go make it another time? And how am I going to say no to that? How am I going to keep them? I didn't have the money at the time to do something nice like that, so yeah, you know what? Go ahead, have fun, enjoy yourself. I'll see you next time. And it was starting to get to a point where I wasn't seeing them for like a month or so. And it was getting to me. And I ended up going to her house. And knocking on the door. She seen it was me, slammed the door and kicking the door in. I want to see my kids. And she threatened to call the cops. And she knew my record, she knew that, hey, all I got to do is tell them, you came in and, threatened me and, next, I'm going in, so I would leave, and it got to me. I started getting that anger again. I started using heavily, and not caring, and my family would see that, my sister, and, they would always see me with the kids on my weekend or whatever, and we would do small things, go to the park or something, but, I didn't have the money to do anything nice like I used to, and they were getting older at the time, and so I was just like, you know, I sunk, you know, I sunk. I was just like, all right, whatever, started doing come ups, started my old behavior again, doing crime and, you know, seeing my family, thinking that I was so far into the drugs that it was because of that I was neglecting my kids, not knowing that she was the one keeping them from me, because I kept to myself. I didn't tell my family what she was doing or how, I just like, whatever, that's our business, you know what I mean? Like, I've always kept to myself, I'll go through it, that's my problem. And, I remember one time my sister, you're not even, a father for your kids no more. And I snapped, I remember just punching her door in her bedroom, and I put my whole fist through the whole door, and her husband and one of my cousins were just looked shocked, like, what's going on, and what hurt the most is like my sister's all, what? Go ahead, you're gonna hit me? And I never put my hands on a female, you know what I mean? And for her to even think that, I was just like, it hurt my heart, So I left my sister's house, and I was homeless. I was out on the streets, I was living in my car, and, by this time I had a Camaro, and I had tweaked so bad because, the stuff I was doing, I knew people were trying to follow me, and, I had that mindset, and I tore my car looking for, little transmitters or whatever, you know what I mean? And I got to the point where my car wasn't drivable for a little bit. And so I'd sleep in my car, and, it started to, I'd be sleeping out there and my sister would send someone to give me a plate of food or something, and, it took a while, but, started going back into my sister's house. But, there were some times I would even be there. I'd be, out on the streets, at parks or wherever, just camping out, doing whatever, go do a mission and, find somewhere to hide out. And, I ended up getting so far gone, man, that, I ended up doing a robbery that was on the news in Buena Park. It was televised. And I remember one of my aunts calling me up, Mijo, was that you? And I'm all like, what are you talking about? And I'm all like, yeah, I seen you on the news. And I'm like, no, Tia, that wasn't me, And I was like, man, and, and because of that, someone had ratted me out in Placencia, because I would drink with Fullerton, Buena Park, Placencia, Santa Ana, those were like my stomping grounds, and, someone in Placencia, had seen the big witness hotline or whatever it was and figured this is a come up for them, and hey, they're going to rat me out. So, they formed a task force. It was Buena Park PD, Fullerton, Santa Ana, and Placencia PD. And, I knew I was being followed, because I would be in my car and, I'd be in the fast lane, and I pay attention to my surroundings. I always have. That's one thing I'm really good at, wherever I go, whether it be a bar, a restaurant, nightclub, I'm always peeping game, looking, where's the exit, who's all there, I could read the crowd, know if someone's going to start some trouble or know if someone's walking my way to start some trouble, and so, I knew I was being followed, so I'd be in the fast lane and I would just cut the whole traffic, not caring who I'm cutting off, just go and get off the first exit, and I would see some car, trying to do the same thing, and I'll be like, yep, I'm being followed. So I would, hit the streets and just start zigzagging, and I go back to my sister's pad and I'd be like, hey, I'm being followed, and she's like, boo, you smoked out, you're not being followed. And I go, yeah, I'm being followed, and, it wasn't until, they must have followed me maybe a good month or so, I think they were trying to catch me in the act of something else or something, and, I remember cops be posted off of off ramp knowing I'm going to be getting off the off ramp, and get pulled over for something cheesy, no turn signal or something. And I remember one time I had a bunch of stuff hidden in my car and a strap on me, and I got pulled over. And there I am again. God, please don't let me go to jail. I got this. I'm done for. I'm trying to do right. I'm trying to do what I can. Get back in my kids' life. Don't. I'm trying to quit the drugs. I'm trying. Just I need help. Help me with my addiction. And I remember when he pulled me over, we kind of went this like little alleyway. And as you're tweaking, you got your pockets are full of all kinds of stuff, and I had a hoodie on and it was packed with, I don't know, a bunch of stuff, keychains and, knickknacks. And so it was pretty heavy. And then I had my strap on me as well. And I remember him asking if I had anything in the car, anything on me. And I was like, no, sir. I'm trying to be as polite as possible, and he goes, well, I'm going to do you a quick pat down. And I remember just literally sticking my stomach in so far and trying to be anorexic, and him patting my hoodie, and my pockets right there, my waistband, and what's all that? And I'm trying to grab things to show him, oh, it's just this, and he's all like, don't put your hands in there. And he's kind of just reaching and touching it real quick, and then he's all like, all right, sit down right there, and he's all, I'm gonna check your car. And, he's trying to call for backup. I hear him calling for backup, as he's leaning in my car. So he didn't handcuff me or nothing. He sat me down. So I'm like trying to reach while he's looking, in the car. And I'm looking at him to see if he's not trying to look back. And I grab my strap and I kind of do like a little hand motion where, I kind of look kind of handicapped, where I'm trying to move it up my shoulder and kind of reach back and put it on the rear wheel, because I'm sitting right by the wheel and trying to put it on the wheel so it's not visible. And I finally get it on the tire, and then he's like, all right, stand up. So I stand back up, and now he's doing the full on, puts my hands behind my back, and he's holding my hands, and now he's using his other hand to really rub my waistband and pull everything out of my pockets, and, luckily, I don't know what it was, because I know I must have probably had some type of driving unsuspended or something, because that was my whole thing, and, he's all like, all right, you're free to go. And so I hop in the car and I go, and I was like, man, thank you, Jesus. Thank you, God. And I remember just going and getting rid of the strap, and just in case they're going to come back, and I was just so lost, and I kept praying, I'm wanting my kids back in my life, and telling them to help me, just do whatever you have to do to help me, and the Lord works in mysterious ways, and the things I notice throughout my life, he does. It's different than anything you're used to. It's weird situations. It's the stuff that makes you think and makes you look back and know that the only reason or the only outcome this happened is a miracle, or it's because of him. And that's how he lets you know that I'm here, I'm working in your life, and, it was probably, I don't know, I want to say a month after that, or not even maybe a month, maybe 2-3 weeks, they raided my sister's pad, and lo and behold, it's those cars that, that I was seeing, I told my sister it's a burgundy van, and they raided her pan looking for me, and she called me up, brother. They just raided my pad. They're looking for you. And so I was like, man, all right, trying to stay away, and I don't know how they found me, but I was driving and a car got behind me. Sirens. It was an unmarked car, got behind me, sirens. And, they tried to play it off, didn't know. And then they seen my tattoos, my neck. And they're like, hey, isn't that guy, that's on the news? And I'm like, what are you talking about? Like, oh, that tattoo looks the same, And so they, we're taking you in because you're a person of interest, or you look like a person of interest, And so they ended up taking me down to the police station and interrogating me, And of course, I'm denying the whole thing. That's not me, And, so I ended up getting busted for armed robbery. And, went to prison, but I was fighting my case in county for a while, Cases like that where they're high profile, it takes a while, you just don't get sentenced, it's months and months of going to court, and I was fighting this for a while. I want to say probably a good year or so, in court, and this whole time, of going to jail, you run into the same homies, the same people, I used to run into my cousins all the time and be like, hey, what's going on? And I used to think that was cool, because back then it was just one gangster party, 3 meals a day, you ain't got no worries, no cares, ain't no bills to pay, And I used to think that was the life, and I used to think this is me, I'm gonna be like my dad, I'm gonna be incarcerated my whole life. I know nothing more, and so. When I first started getting busted, I used to notice.
Before you go, I have a question for you, Paul. What really upset you so much when your sister told you, you know, what went through your mind and your heart and everything when she said that you weren't being a dad to your kids?
That I was like my father.
That triggered you?
Yeah. The thing that I had so much anger growing up and so much hate in my body, and a promise I made to myself that I'd never do that to my kids. That by her saying that just made me reflect, like I'm like my father. And but I like I said, I ended up going to prison. And, this whole time as I'm getting locked up, I used to have that, like I said, my dad was well known. So I used to, oh, you're his son, and I would get special treatment. I'm used to be like, no. So anything while I was locked up, I'd always raise my hand for it. I was always doing the dirty work in there and doing, the stuff. Someone needed to be touched up. I was the one, going in their cell and, giving them a beating, and I was known as the main torpedo, and, so I started looking at it like, okay, this is it. I'm going to be the one, that's well known in prison, in the system, make a name for myself, that's all I got, and, so I started doing my time and doing what I had to do, and ended up getting sentenced and going to, holding in Wasco, went to holding for a while and, ended up going to Corcoran State Prison, and I heard stories about that prison. It was pretty bad, and, I was locked down most of the time, and there was enemies galore, from the northerners, to bulldogs to, and, I was known, for being a part of the Sureños, in the South, and, so, growing up in that lifestyle, you got to do what you got to do in there, no questions asked, and, but it, it got to the point where I was in there and, I thought that was my life was over. I thought that was it. I was first looking at 18 years. And I would pray all the time in there. Like, help me get through this. Help me be there for him. Don't let me be my dad. Don't let me be incarcerated and not there for my kids. I ended up they ended up giving me 5. So I was like, all right, I could do that. But I was just so involved in the politics in there that, there was some stuff where I could have got caught up, do more time, and so, I started thinking, okay, well, maybe this is it. Maybe this is my life, and it wasn't until something happened to my daughter, with their mom, her boyfriend, her fondled her while she was sleeping. And that right there broke my heart. As a father and not being able to protect your daughter, like, that hurt. I blamed myself for it because, the stupid stuff I was doing to get me in that spot, to get me where I'm at. And now I'm in a place where I can't reach her. And so that hurt, and again, my anger turned up, and I told the homies, yeah, I got to kick this off, I got to let some anger out. If I got something coming, because at this time, they were trying to keep the peace. There's certain times where there's, we're at war, and there's certain times things are just going on where, hey, it's cool for now, and I go, I gotta kick this off, man. I gotta release this, And they're all like, do what you gotta do. I go, if I got something coming, I gotta be taxed in the end, then I got what's coming, I'll take it. So I did, I kicked it off, ended up hurting some fools, and dealt with my consequences, But it wasn't until shortly after that, that 2 of the enemies came in my cell, both strapped with homemade shanks, And I was like, man, this is it. They're coming back for me, this is it. And I was just praying to myself again, like, Lord, I know I'm going to get hurt, but don't let me not be there for my kids. I'm not doing too much time. I'll be out, and I'll get right, I'll do what I got to do, And luckily, I had a tattoo session, and one of my homies, another homie from Pomona, different neighborhood, came through, he was like looking for me because we were going to get tatted. And he seen that those 2 fools were getting ready to come at me. So me and him just kind of jumped on them, and, we were going at it for a while. And then got to the point where everybody just went their own way, before they came in and, busted everybody. We kind of just, hey, it's neutral right now, so we went our ways. So I was like, man, thank you, I mean, I got a little scuffed up, I got, a couple of slices, but it wasn't too bad. And, went to my tattoo session, get the tattoo, and we're talking about it, and, talking about what we were going to do again. And it wasn't shortly after that where I got a letter stating that my kids were going to be in the system, that, my kids' mom had a baby with, her man, and the baby was born under the influence. So they wanted to come in and take my kids. So they wanted to know if I wanted to go back to the courts and fight for them, So I'm like, I'm there, I signed up for it, So I'm just like, all right, thank you, God. This is my opportunity to get my kids back in my life. I'll do whatever I have to do, And so I'm like, great, I'll do it. I'll be there. And it took some time for them to actually, the paperwork to go through and me to go back to county. But in that meantime, something happened where my Sally did something, and crossed the wrong people. And they told me, it's my Sally for me to take care of it. And it was something that, had to be done, and it was bad. This is something I probably could spend the rest of my life in prison for, And I was just like, man, here we go again. I'm trying to get there for my kids, I need to get there for my kids. I got this opportunity to be there for my kids. But now, because of my lifestyle and the choices I made, I'm stuck in here in politics. It's either I take care of it or, now I'm going to have someone coming in and someone's going to be taking care of me. And I'm not going to be there for my kids. So I'm like, all right, And I remember that night, because it had to be done right away. And I remember that night, I didn't sleep a wink, just praying that whole night, like, Lord, you know my heart. You know what my true intentions are. Yeah, I'm caught up in this situation. I got to do what I got to do, or I won't be there for my kids. Please forgive me for what I'm about to do. And please help me, get me through this, and keep in mind, I've been, like I said, incarcerated most of my life and, done a lot, and they always come in deep. As soon as something pops off, man, sirens blow, they come in deep, the whole squad, pepper spray, zip ties, and they just handle it, everybody on the floor, they zip tie everybody, and, and so I'm like, all right, and, I had to take a little bit of contraband to the back, and so I had that, and those that know how to carry contraband in there, it wasn't a comfortable feeling, just put it that way. And, so, I'm like, all right, but I prayed that whole night. And I remember going down to chow, and in there, every morning, every night, you greet everybody, give them their saludos, hey, good morning, buenos dias, and you greet everybody. Well, when I came to him, I had a lock in a sock, and they tried to get me something else, but they couldn't get it to me in time, so that's what they gave me. And I remember when I went to reach to shake his hand, he reached out his hand, I pulled it from my back, and I just swung. The first swung cut him, split his ear in half. Then I came back the other way and hit him across his eyebrow and split a big old gash across his eyebrow. And the whole plan was I was supposed to do it and get rid of it because I couldn't get caught with, a weapon in my hand. And, I was trying to, make this where I didn't get, as much time as, it was a plan, and it was a strategic planning to get this done and try to, least amount of consequences, And the guy that was supposed to get rid of it just looked at it, And I jumped back on this, and I'm hitting them, socking them, we're at it, There's blood every place. I'm trying to get a hold of them and grab a grip. Those who fight in blood know how slippery it is, and I'm just all over the place. And I just remember looking back to say, okay, when you guys coming in, and the guy that was supposed to get rid of the weapon, he didn't get rid of it. And now the guy that I hit has it in his hand, and he's just making a scene now. He's just yelling and screaming and swinging it like a lasso above his head and trying to come at me. I remember getting a chair, and as he swung, it wrapped around the chair leg, and I pulled it, and it yanked out of his hand, and I threw it back down on the floor, and I gave that homie the look. I looked at him gave him that stare boo, and he looked at me and grabbed it and got rid of it, and I jumped back on the guy, and we're just going at it. And then, literally, we're going at it for so long, I'm getting winded, and they're not coming in. I'm looking back, and they're just looking in this direction, and finally, one of the bigger homies said, all right, that's it, and he called it off. So I'm like, all right. And they told me go get cleaned up. They got rid of my clothes. I'm showering up. And I remember crying in the shower, and just thanking God, thanking him. I can't explain it. And even to this day, I've ran into, people that I've been busted with, and, even that morning, everybody was shocked. They seen them looking in, no siren, no nothing, and that right there is probably what really changed my life. That right there, seeing that miracle, I wish, it could be where, you're seeing two things play out in once, and you have one screen on one and the split screen, you see the actual truth, and then you see what they see, you know what I mean? I wish that at that time people could actually see, and they could see the miracle, that he created to keep that from them coming in, And I remember just crying in the shower and thanking God, like, oh man, knowing that I did my part, I did what I had to do. So no, nothing's coming back at me. You know what I mean? My only thing was now, we didn't get removed. We didn't go to the back. So now he's still going to be in that same thing, and it was crazy because he ended up getting called for UA testing, where they test for drugs and stuff. And, some of the homies tried to, clean them up as much as possible, try to keep the gashes from opening up. But they knew something happened, and so they pulled him aside, and asked him what happened. I guess, he told them he fell in the shower. And I remember him after chow, during the afternoon, I had people come in, after I took a shower, that went to breakfast because I missed breakfast, bringing me a bunch of food and taking care of me, And I remember probably after lunch, I seen him come back, and I'm like, oh, great. I'm saddled up with this guy now, now I got to worry about him wanting his get backs, So when Yard opened up, I talked to the homies, and I'm like, look, like I did my part, what's up, what's going to happen, this is my Sally, And that first night, I remember talking to him, and it was like, oh, like, you know the politics. I don't know what you did, man, but you know the politics. You ain't no newbie at this, I suggest you do what you got to do, get this cleared up, and hopefully you could clear it up, but I still had that thought in my mind, like, now this fool's gonna try to get me while I'm sleeping or something, so I didn't sleep all night. I remember he had the top bunk, and I remember him jumping down to use the restroom, and I kind of just moved back in my bottom bunk, just to see if he came at me. I had my fist up, and he kind of laughed. And I was like, what's so funny? Like, I ain't stupid. I'm not gonna, what I mean? You want to get your get backs, He's all, you're cool. I was like, all right, you say that, but I ain't taking your word for it, I remember the next day going back to Yard, and I'm like, man, this fool's my Sally. What's going on? And they're like, don't worry, we're going to handle it. Well, they ended up having a bunch of youngsters jump on them, and it wasn't even as bad. I mean, there was this couple of swings, and sirens went off, and right there, same area where our scenario went down, I mean, they didn't even get a couple of swings in, and already they went in, but I was like, you know what? Thank God he's no longer on this yard, because they're going to take him, probably to the hole or something, And, so I was like, thank you, God, and shortly after that, I was called to roll it up, to go to county, to go to the courts there and, try and do what I had to do to fight for my kids, and, I remember doing what I had to do in courts, and back in county, it was on and cracking too, it was, and, the homies knowing I came from an active yard like Corcoran, they were all, trying to see what was up, and, and I'm just trying to, keep away from some of that, try not to get too much involved, just as, I know any little thing could get me caught up again, and I'm made it to court, and I'm trying to do what I got to do, and I remember it was green light on a certain race in there, and I was in county for a little bit, and then I heard I was going to have a layover in Chino. I wasn't going straight to Corcoran back to my yard, I was going to have a layover in Chino. So I was like, great, I'm going to another yard, where, it's on site, it's green light, and I remember it was overcrowded, and I ended up getting to the gym, and I seen a race that was, supposed to be green light. I seen that race in there, and, so I'm like, all right, and first thing you do when you get somewhere is see who has the keys, and see who's calling the shots there. So I do that, let them know who I am and, who has the keys. And I'm like, all right. And I was like, hey, well, what's up with this? It's supposed to be green lit, what's going on? And he's all like, oh, it's cool right now. It's cool. Don't trip, And I was like, my first day there, so I'm like, all right, usually you take, the homie calling the shots word, so I'm like, all right, whatever, and I was there, a couple of days, and I'm going to chow in the morning, and I run into one of my homies from my neighborhood. He's seen me, and he's in one of those little cages they have, something must have happened where, he's in one of those little cages and being questioned and just stripped down to his boxers, and he's all like, hey, fool, where you at? I told him, hey, I'm in the gym right now. I just got here. And he's all like, all right. He's all, I'll get at you. Well, later that night, I got a little huila. It's a little kite they send, that, it's like a little mail service, and it was attention me. So, they gave it to me and I opened it up and, it told me what I thought all along. He's all like, what's going on? We've been sending kites over there to kick it off. We haven't heard nothing, what's going on? So I'm like, man, great. Here I am again in a situation where now someone knows I'm there. He knows I'm a rider. He knows I'm going to take care of it, and I know definitely he's all like telling someone else, hey, I got at my homie, I just sent him a kite. I know he'll something's going to happen, just don't trip. He'll take care of it, I know he's telling someone, so I'm just like, great. So I tell, some of the homies that were in question about it too, I told me, check it out, I got to kick this off. They're all like, let's do it. I got you, And so sure enough, as soon as, I had that chance, I kicked it off, and right there in Chino, they have a gunner right above you, there's a gunner right there. And they, next thing you know, I kick it off and, they hit us with a block gun. It's called little rubber bullets that shoot everywhere, And I remember getting hit and just hitting the floor. And, I'm trying to, scoot. And I'm like going underneath bunks and, taking people's commissary between my legs and just trying to get as far away from where it happened as possible, And, they came in deep, and they came in, zip tied everybody. And as they're pulling people up, each time they pull someone up, I see the guy that pulls them up looking at the gunner. So I'm like, oh man, they're looking for someone, and because I kicked it off, I'm like, they're looking for me, and as soon as he pulls me up, and I'm already a ways, I'm thinking, all right, I'm far enough from where it happened that they're not gonna find me, but like I said, I'm tatted, I got a big visible tattoo on my neck that's very visible, and there ain't no other tattoo like it, and so I'm like, great. And as soon as he pulls me up, yeah, he nods his head like, yeah. So they grab me, same thing, they strip me down to my boxers. I'm in one of those cages now, and I'm just sitting there. I must have been there, I don't know, 12 hours, maybe even longer. I had two different sergeants come up and interrogate me like, why'd you start this? And I'm same thing, it wasn't me. Like, what I mean? Like, just I'm bald headed and tatted up. Don't mean that was me, like, I'm just trying to do my time, sir. Like, I came down from Corcoran and, oh, you're from Corcoran? Yeah, you did start this. No, it wasn't me. I'm trying to get custody of my kids, sir. I just, had a layover. I was down in county, the main jail, like, oh, like, I'm just trying to get home and get to my kids, my time's almost up, I just got a little bit more time, and I'll be home. I'll be on parole, and you could look at my record, you could see that, I have no points against me, no write-ups, no nothing, and, it took them, their investigation, and all that, and then they came back, all right, we ain't got no solid evidence to hold you for this, but we're gonna keep my eye on you, we're watching you. So I'm like, you do what you gotta do, I'm not going anywhere. I'm just trying to get home to my kids, and So maybe about a week after that, got called to roll it up to go back to my state, the state prison, and I did what I had to do there, tried to keep out of trouble, started telling the homies what was going on, and told them, how my kids and what happened to my daughter, and they knew all that, so they were like, you know what, do what you got to do to be there for them, like a lot of them had kids, so a lot of them could relate, and so I'm like, all right. So, things that had to happen or things that were involved, they tried to keep me out of it, so I didn't get no more, and that's rare, there ain't too many, especially nowadays, like I heard it's just so messed up, and, keep in mind, this was back in, '05, '06, because I got out of prison in '06, and I ended up paroling to a place called the Phoenix House, and it's something that I signed up for while I was in prison because I knew if I paroled to the streets, chances are I could be involved in other stuff, and I was trying to still get some type of structure, While I was in prison, I, started going to those NA meetings that they have and the little church things that they had, and just, wanting to really thank the Lord because I know it was a miracle that kept me out of that situation, And so it was kind of my way of thanking them because I'm pretty sure in the promise that I made, if he got me out of it, that I'll change my life around, and I wanted to keep to it, So I paroled, to the Phoenix House and, was doing my thing. And me, I've always been a leader, I was always wanted to be the one calling shots because I didn't like no one telling me what to do, I grew up, like I told you guys, my own man at an early age and did what I want to do. And that was it, and so, I think the counselors recognized that I had just that aura or that, appearance to be like, all right, and, if things needed to be done around there, clean up or whatever, I would get the people motivated to do it, I'd be like, hey, let's clean up this, our area. Let's do this, let's do that, And so they ended up having me manage sober living homes, which was a plus because I got a little bit more benefits, and, I paroled on high control parole and I had social services as well on my butt because, they were making sure I had to do everything I had to do, And I got to say, man, that was probably the hardest time in my life because, when you got someone on your tail, in your face telling you, you can't do this, you got to do this, you got to do that, when I was so used to doing what I wanted to do and, and having to bite my tongue and just go with the flow, because I couldn't afford not to. It was the hardest time in my life, and not only that, just the things they had me do, I had to go through parenting, through anger management classes, through everything all the classes that they had me, I had to do it, and I was testing 3 times a week and, I had to find a job, I had to find a place to live, to get my kids back, and it took me some time, because I was with the Phoenix House for a while, did their whole program. And it got to the point where, they give you a certain amount of time. You have your inpatient, your outpatient. And, once you reach outpatient, now you got a certain time to find a job. And they give you a bus pass and they send you out there and you got to show proof that you applied for jobs and all that. And I was applying everywhere and no one wanted to hire me, because of my record, through my life, there was times where I had jobs, but I would be let go because I didn't have a felony or I didn't have this on my record, and they find out and, they would be like, oh, sorry, you lied on your application. So, this time I was like, I got to tell the truth, and I would do that, I would say, yeah, I have a felony, and they want to know what it was for. And, people didn't want to hire me, and, they gave me a little bit extension just because, I was going above and beyond and I was managing and helping out and helping run the Phoenix House. That they gave me a little bit more time than the rest to find a job, but it was cutting close, I mean, it was like maybe I want to say a week or two that I had left to find a job, and, I was already saying, this ain't going to work. I did all this and this ain't gonna work. I made a phone call to one of my homies. Hey, I need this, I need that, I need that. Get it for me, you know. I'm gonna go start doing what I need to do, you know. And he would tell me, "You sure? You know, you sure that's what you want?" I'm like, "I got no choice, man. I got no choice. I'm trying to do right. I got no choice, you know." And then something just reached out to me, you know, and I started praying again. You know, I was like, "Lord, you gave me that miracle. You made it a way for me to be here to fight for my kids. How can this be happening? How can you put me in a situation where now I'm going to go back to my old ways?" You know, and I want to say, man, it was pretty quick. I'm a day or two after that, maybe. One of the homies from the Phoenix house be like, "Hey, Bo, I'm working at this place and they're parole friendly, you know, and they're looking to hire, you know, there's people from all over, homies from Los, homies from OC, you know, and they got records, you know, like, don't trip, you know, I told the manager about you and he wants to interview with you." And I was like, "Are you serious?" And he's like, "Yeah." And I remember just, again, man, thank you, God. Thank you. I already had it in my heart where, like, man, I go back to my old ways, you know, and nobody wanted to hire me. I must have applied for 40 different jobs, you know, and no one wanted to hire me. But now, you know, he put someone in my life at the Phoenix house that got a job at a place where he was able to reach out to me, you know, and tell me, "Hey, you know, I told him about you, you know, he wanted to hire you." And I remember meeting with him, I want to say it was a Friday, and telling him, "Hey, you know, this is my situation. I got no choice but to work my butt off and to prove to you that I'm worth keeping, you know, but this is what I'm going through. I'm on high control parole. I got social services. I'm testing 3 times a week and it's on call, you know, whenever they, you know, buzz me and I got to, you know, I got 2 hours to get there to give them a test, you know, so I'm going to have to leave work. I'm going to have to, you know, do this." And he's like, you know, and I explained to him, you know, "I'm fighting for my kids. I need this, you know," and he's like, "Can you start Monday?" And I was like, "I'm there, you know, I'm there. Don't trip." And, you know, I had that mindset like, all right, you know, I got to prove myself. I got to work twice as hard, you know. And that's all I did, man. I focused, you know, I went in, learned what I could, and I'm a quick learner, you know, you got to teach me once, you know, I got the mechanical skills, I got, you know, the construction background, you know, I'm capable of doing whatever you need me to do. Just, you know, show me how to do it the first time, you know. And, you know, I would learn all the sub assemblies and everything they did, you know, and I noticed that, you know, most of the homies would just chill, you know, they would just kick back and take their time doing it, you know. And I'd be like, man, you know, that's not me. I got to knock it out and learn something new, you know. So they put me on a sub assembly and I would knock it out and go back to the manager. "All right, I'm done with this." "Oh, you're done? Okay, you know, go help them out with these sub assemblies, you know." And before you knew it, I was learning everything, you know. And you know, he even pulled me in. He's all like, "Man, I love your hustle, you know." And I was like, "Man, I got no choice, man. You know, I got to show you guys, you know, I can't afford to be judged by the way I look and, you know, be let go when I got this opportunity, you know." And so, you know, during that time, though, you know, it was hard for me, you know, because it started getting to the point where, man, you got to leave again, man, you know. And, you know, I was like, but it wasn't my manager, it was upper management. Like, why is he always leaving, you know? And, you know, I explained to him, but I guess he didn't explain to them, you know, but he vouched for me, you know. He's all like, "Hey, he's my hardest worker. You know, the time he's here, he gets done more than 3 of these other fools, you know, so we can't let him go, you know." And, you know, he called me in. He's like, "Hey, you know, this is starting to be a problem, you know." So I reached out to my parole and social services and told them, "Look, man, you guys want me to do all this for you guys and jump through hoops but, you know, I have to have this job, you know, and I finally have an opportunity and you guys ain't making it easy for me, you know. They're getting mad because I'm taking up, you know, 3 times a week to test and they got work that needs to be done, you know." And so it got to the point where it was starting to work less and less. They were like, "All right, you know, we'll work together, parole work with social, you know, if something happens, they contact social and vice versa, you know." And so I was like, all right, cool, so they started making it a little easier. And, I was doing what I had to do, to get off parole, and, I winded up getting an early discharge because of it, I would think I was supposed to be on for like 2 years and end up being on for like a year and a half, because I was going above and beyond, But after parole, I still had social services that I was working with, and it took me 2 years going above and beyond with them to, not missing court dates, not missing any appearances, and doing what I had to do. And, my kids' mom not showing up and, her still being high on drugs. And, she ended up having like 2 or 3 other kids under the influence, and, so social services was looking at this like, wow, and, they ended up saying, okay, you got custody of your kids, and, I ended up, my 17-year-old son, my daughter was already, or I think she was maybe 17. My son was 16. I don't know. He was still a teenager in high school. And, but my daughter already, had a kid, and she, was going through the court system to get emancipated. So the only one that I ended up really getting custody of was my son, and, started putting him through high school and stuff like that. And, bust my butt for 2 years, ended up becoming a supervisor at my job, and, I remember getting flack because there was guys 5-6 years there, and, them having, thinking because they were there longer that job should be theirs, but just with any company, they hire the people and put in the right places that, are worthy of it, and, but I told them, I used to run it, once I got hired supervisor, I started running it like a prison. I still had that mindset, where, because I had to, that's the only way I could reach these guys, because once I started being a supervisor, I'd pull their records and I'd pull their, what they were making and how many raises they got, and it made me understand why they didn't bust their butt, why they just sat there and collected a paycheck. I was like, wow, these guys got a 10-cent raise last year. Like, I wouldn't be busting my butt either, And so when I became supervisor, I had a meeting with the manager and I told him, look, you put me in this position to run the show because I know all the sub-assemblies already, I know how to run this certain line, and I go, you want to make a change? You want this company to turn around? Let me run it like I know how to run it. Don't fight me on it. Don't micromanage me. And he's all like, you know what? The production floor is yours. Do what you want. So I would have meetings, and say, look I'm calling shots now. Kind of like a prison would. This is what I need you guys to do. And I would pull them aside. One by one. I'd be like, look, you got a raise. 10 cents. Your next raise, I'll get you $1. Get it to where you're making some decent money and you can, support kids and do what you got to do, make it worth your while. You look out for me and I'll look out for you. And that was my whole mindset. You look out for me, I'm going to, look out for you. And, what they didn't take me serious at first. They're like, yeah, right. You're going to give me $1, And I remember one of the homies, he was from Norwalk. He came to me. He's all like, hey, well, you serious about that $1? And I was like, yeah, but I need you to step it up. You've been here. He was there like 4 years, I think, already. I go, you know a lot, man. I could learn from you, but, I need you to step it up. I need you to start, showing me that you're capable, and I promise you, I'll get you that $1, and he's like, all right. I go, you got my word on that, man. And his review came around, and I would keep spreadsheets of his old work and, work that he was doing now, and I would take it to my manager. I would look, his review's coming around. I need to give him $1, and this is how we change things here. Once they see that I'm serious and, I go, some of the homies, listen to what he has to say because he's been here a while, and they kind of look up to him. But, we look out for him. It's going to change things around, And so he's all like, all right, we'll do it. And I showed him the studies of, he was doing some of the sub-assembly. He'd do it like maybe 40 of one an hour, and now he's doing 70, and so his the rate went up, and I go, this is, all of them are capable of this, but he's the only one motivated right now. And we start giving them the pay their worth. I could have that whole crew doing the same thing, and they were tripping out on just the way my thoughts were and the way I was strategic and planning things, and when that review came around, I told them, pulled them in, I was like, hey, that raise I told you about the dollar? He's like, yeah. I go, guess what? He's like, what? I go, you got $1.50. And he's all, what? And they get him $1.50 because of, they seen the time studies, and they wanted to pay him like, hey, and they know if he can do it, then the rest of them could do it, because they all been there the same amount of time. They all know the same stuff, and they knew that this was going to be the turnaround, because I told them this is how we turn it around. And, I told him, hey, just keep it to yourselves, don't tell no one. But I already knew he was going to, because he came out with a smile on his face after I pulled him out of the, little interview, and his review. And seen him go to the home.
The place you're still at right now, right?
I was there for 14 years. I ended up working my way up to upper management. I did turn that place around. I became a production manager. When they opened up a new facility, they wanted me to lean it out, because I learned lean processes and stuff like that. So I had a bunch of Kanban systems. I laid out the production floor pretty much in the assembly line, so it flowed, one way, and then it got to where all the sub-assemblies are built, to the machine finally built, to the QC process, to it being shipped, and I set up the whole production floor like that. And, the whole time I was there 14 years, I became an operations manager, where I had 4 different departments that reported to me. And my last position there was a supply chain project manager, where I was creating different fixtures for, helping the production floor and engineering, and, but that's when COVID hit, and that's when a lot of the jobs got put on hold. A lot of people were getting fired, and I was making $86,000 at that time, just in the position I was in. And to me, that's an accomplishment in itself. I didn't have a high school diploma. I barely had my GED. And no degree or nothing, but because of my hard work, that company looked out for me. And like I said, this is something that changed my life around. It definitely made a difference. And after that, it hit though, and I ended up losing my job, because of COVID. They couldn't afford to keep the spot, and no one wanted to hire managers at the time, and so I ended up finding another job at a company called All Star Auto Lights, but during that time while I was finding my kids, I kind of left out. I found another mother in my life, and we got married. I had 2 kids with her, and I tried to learn from the mistakes I made with my oldest of not being there. I had that resentment and hatred in my heart, but I realized like I did the same to them. Even though when I got out and was still part of their lives for a little bit, each time I got busted, I was still not there for them, in parts of their lives, and kind of made me realize that, because of the lifestyle I lived, I kind of looked at my dad's lifestyle and knew now that he wasn't there because of the lifestyle he lived, and so I forgave him, and he ended up passing away during COVID, but I had an opportunity to tell him, I forgive him, and that, I really enjoyed the time that we did have together, and I wish things could have been different, but, my second baby mama, though, same scenario, she was, when I got with her and going through social services, she was using at the time, and I told her, that she needed to stop, and she had promised, and she ended up getting pregnant, and we had, kids together, and during the whole time she would use, and I would leave and go back, still in love with that family, trying to make this family work, my first one didn't work, and trying to stay there and put up with things to try to make it work. And just things going on, and I remember praying, and telling them, knowing that she was, but wanting to catch her in the act to, say, okay, I caught you. I got proof now, and I remember I would sit there and pray, and be like, Lord, just give me a sign, and it would be weird because sometimes, the door would creep open and I'd be like, who's there, and I would get up to look to see, and peek around the corner in the kitchen and like, who was that, and another peek around the corner again and catch her, hiding dope in her sock or, something. I'd be like, oh, busted. And she'd be like, what? And I was like, you know what, and I would catch her and be like, you know what, that's it, and I would leave for a little bit and then go back again, and because she would promise, right, I'm going to stay sober. And she even tried rehab a couple of times, and it didn't work out. And, it got to the point where my kids were already older, and my daughter's all like, Dad, why don't we just leave? And I was like, well, you want to leave? She's all like, yeah. And that's all it took. Out here I'm thinking, I'm trying to give them, the life that, I didn't have, the mom, the dad. But again, neglecting them, being miserable, locked in my room, but still going to work and staying sober and doing what I had to do, to get everything done, and, so, I ended up leaving her too. I was with my first kid's mom for 14 years and my second for 16 years, putting up with it the whole time. And, never once, using that as an excuse to go back to the drug that took everything from me, I'm happy to say, it's been 20 years. I've been clean off methamphetamine, the drug that took everything from me. I drink every once in a while. I have a beer, but to me, alcohol was never an issue for me, and I work hard, and just having a beer, a 6-pack could sit in my fridge for a week, you know what I mean? It's not every day. And, I may come home one day and have a beer, but, he saved me from that life that destroyed me. And he's turned my life around in so many ways, and, I am truly blessed, I got full custody and sole custody of my 2 teens right now. And, it's been rough. It's rough, I met someone else in my life right now, and she's, a God-fearing woman, her kids are into church as well, and, we're trying our best, it was hard, trying to get into this place. I was in a car accident, and a couple of years ago, when I first started faith ministry, the morning devotionals and stuff, I was in the car accident and, trying to go through the courts and everything that they got to do, even though I follow God now daily and, I may not go to church, but I speak to him daily. I thank him daily, because...
Is there something that you did last year?
Yeah, I had gotten, when it was a while back, when I first left my kids' mom, it was actually 4 years ago. I had gotten baptized, and that was
Praise God.
That was the real changing in my life, because, even though, I didn't go back to the drugs and do all that, and I wasn't, robbing and stealing and hurting people no more, I was still missing something in my life, and, when I got baptized, I was looking, for something different, not the same thing that I was used to all my life, the drug addict baby mamas, and the just that in my life, I couldn't have it no more, and when I got baptized, that was the change of things. I really started seeing things work in my favor. I was able to get an apartment. It was rough, but when I got full and sole custody of my kids, I was staying at my mom's house for a little bit and doing my best to get my credit straight and get an apartment for us to live in. And I did that. Had that apartment for a year. And within that time, met someone else in my life, and, we wanted to get a place together as well and start our lives. And, it was rough. It was rough getting in the apartment, and I would just pray, and he put me in that apartment. My credit wasn't so great, and and same thing with this house. I was looking, my credit was gone, and I was looking, and it was getting denied, and I already gave my lease up, my notice, so I had to be out of the apartment at a certain place. So if this didn't happen, I was going to be homeless. I was going to have no place to take my kids. And I remember just praying and praying, like, hey, put me in this new place, and we seen a lot of places.
I remember that.
And this house is the only house that we didn't get a look at, and I was just like, I had met him like at a Starbucks, and, we came here, and I was thinking, man, this is fishy, I'm going to get scammed or something, and he's all like, no, it's just the tenants are in the house, and I don't want to disrupt them, like I said, man, God puts people in your lives in ways that just unexplainable. All the places I did look at, put in applications, and got denied. This was a house where I didn't even get to see the inside before we moved in. I seen the outside, and I met him at a Starbucks, and but it gave me an opportunity when we came to look at the outside of the house to kind of let him know my situation, and I think that's what did it. I told him, look, man, I make good money. I'm a hard worker. This is where I'm going. I got goals. I'm trying to start my own business, and I got things that I'm trying to do, and, I just need someone to give me an opportunity, and he's like, well, yeah, your credit's not that good, but your pay, you make pretty good money. I was like, yeah, and I tried to explain to him my credit, like I was in an accident. I had to max out some of my credit cards, I didn't have a car payment that I have now, and just financially, I was living paycheck by paycheck at that time, and now I got these extra expenses that I'm paying, and I had to let some of those credit cards go, that went to collections, and so my credit started just dropping, and I told him, but I got a lot of things going, I'm trying to get my business going, I got this accident where I'm supposed to get a nice chunk of change once it's over, and I just need to, someone to give me an opportunity. And sure enough, man, we went and signed the papers, and we looked at the inside of this house, and man, it's a beautiful place, It's a 4-bedroom, 2-story house, 3 bathrooms, and I'm blessed. I'm surely blessed, and it's been rough, I'm not going to say, it's been easy, but, like I said, he puts you in situations where he's not going to let you not be able to survive in it,
Amen.
And there's been times where I had to borrow money to cover rent, right now I'm still struggling. I'm in the hole, I was hoping my business would grow, bigger than it is right now to give me that extra income, but, one thing I've learned, it's always in God's timing. It's always in his timing. I look at some of the Bible scriptures, and some of the promises. Even the promises take some time. Abraham, it took him 25 years to get his son. And even when he got his son, he was tested in his faith. Had to get sacrifice. And for him to see him go through the process, to see, okay, he was going to do it, to know the faith, and that's what I see now is just, when I got baptized, my faith grew even stronger, the miracles he provided for me to get me to where I'm at, my faith is in him, and I don't have that worry no more. And, I don't have that anger no more where I used to have, I've been cut off sometimes, and I don't even get mad no more, where I would chase these guys down and cut them off and pull them over and pull them out of their car and, throw glass bottles at their car and break their window. I was bad, and I trip out, and when I got out of prison, that's one thing I know I asked for. I used to pray to get this anger because I knew that's what would put me in situations where I was at, and it wasn't until, I would pray daily on it, get this anger. And it wasn't until someone did cut me off and I realized, what? I didn't chase him down. I'm here praying for him, hoping, and the thing is, like, we look at things differently, like I didn't look at things, maybe this guy cut me out because he was in a hurry, because maybe his kid got hurt, maybe, something happened, a family emergency, or or maybe this was the last time he could be late for work, and was going to get fired. Like, we don't know what goes on through people's lives, that cause them to do the things they do. But we have a forgiving God, and we got to live that life. We got to forgive. We got to be merciful. We got to love one another, and that's the way I look at things now. I tend help, I see myself helping out homeless people a lot, and it's usually the race that I was mean to, the race that, and I don't know if that's just my self-conscience, or if it's God putting it in my heart to make amends for the things I did. I don't know, but I do know that I do have it, and I look out for people now, and I don't see them as that race, where I got to, be aggressive towards them, or, what I mean? I see them as a person in a position where they need help, and that's the thing now, just do our best to help others, what I mean? And put, people that are going through it, let them know there is a God that creates miracles, and we don't have to live that life of addiction and institutional, that he does have a place for us. And, there's probably a lot more I want to share, Pastor, but I know it's getting late. And, I just know, man, that I'm not the person I was once was, and he's made the difference in my life, and it's because of the miracles I've seen, and if you're going through it, and, just know, keep praying, your prayers will be answered, but it's in his timing, and he'll never put you in a situation that he can't get you out of, and, where I'm at now, like I said, I'm struggling. I ain't living that perfect life, or I ain't in a place where I'm comfortable yet, but, I got a roof over my head, my kids ain't starving, they may go to bed sometimes a little hungry because, sometimes there ain't as much food in the fridge as I like, but, the utilities are still on, they ain't, cut the electric bill, what I mean? So I'm still here, and I know for a fact that he'll get me out of this situation. I'm in a little hole right now, but he'll pull me through.
You know what? That's one of the things that I as I was hearing you, when anger really got a hold of you, but then again, you really never had structure. It was a life of chaos, and I know that when you grow up in the hood, and you gotta fend for yourself. Either that, or you're gonna be a pushover, and so, but you continue to survive, and allow God to turn this chaos in your life, into something structured, you know, and now, just putting your faith and trust, yes, we serve a God of mercy and of grace. And I thank the Lord that, you were pointed in the right direction. But, one thing that I also, caught on to, is that you never stop praying to him, regardless if you knew that, the things that, you were getting involved in, you were in survival mode for many years of your life. But, now, let him be the light that guides your steps. And there's this one verse that's in Proverbs 29:11, and it really rings out, to what you're saying. In Proverbs 29:11, it says, "Fools give full vent to their rage, but the wise bring calm in the end." So you might have given rage, but that's all you knew, and in trying to protect, sometimes we become, we self sabotage our own blessing in our life. Also, we tend to become what we're trying to avoid, not knowingly, and we start growing in it. But I really thank God that He, in your heart, you always had Him in there, because you knew who to cry out to and pray, and He heard you.
Yeah, one thing I want to mention too is like during my time of management, I was able to have an opportunity to help out other homies in my situation where they were tired of it. A good homie of mine, Chubbs, passed away not too recently, but I got him a job too. I mean, there's probably good 20 different homies and a bunch of family members I got hired. What I mean, and gave them opportunities. But something that stuck out that he told me, he pulled me aside. I remember we went out, I think St. Patty's Day or something, and he pulled me aside and he thanked me. And he had a little bit of tear in his eye, and this was a big boy, and I was like, "What's wrong, dude? Like, you all right?" And he's all like, "Nah." He's all like, "You know what? I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart." He's all like, "You know what? You saved my life. You gave me an opportunity when no one else did." And I was institutionalized just like yourself, and I know where you come from, and I come from the same background, and you gave me the job when no one else would, and you taught me things I didn't know, and he's all like, "You know what?" He's all, anybody can call shots on the streets, but for you to be calling shots for corporate businesses, he says, think about that. Your record, you don't even got a degree, your criminal background, and you're in upper management, you're calling the shots, you're giving other people opportunities. He's all, think about that. And I never thought about it until that, and it's like, wow. And since then, there's been a lot of people that I know, started their own businesses, were able to get on their feet, and come to me and thank me because, I gave them an opportunity, And there's a lot too that just, took it for granted and are back in the system, but I know that, hey, I was given an opportunity, and if I could give someone that same opportunity, I'm going to do it, because you never know whose life it could change just by, it changed my life by a company giving me a chance when no other company would, and I managed to work my way up in upper management at that company, and I still keep in contact with the people there, right now, the business I'm in, I buy parts for them still, so I go over there on, sometimes, and, still keeping track of the owner of the company at the time. I've refurbished some of his classic cars, rebuilt it, and helped him out, but, it's just that opportunity, that, all people need is that second chance, and those listening in that are gang related or, thinking about going that way or live that lifestyle, it's not the same no more, it's not, back then, earlier times, it was more of a united front, it was more, now it's more power tripping and money hungry and just greedy people and I'm so blessed that I'm not involved in that lifestyle no more, I'm so blessed, and there's so much more blessings out there, what I mean? Just change your life around, like I said, I make really good money right now, and I don't got a degree, but I got that work ethic, and I got that experience in that field, and that's all it takes is just to start getting
You know what you have that's more important than any of that? You have God.
Yes,
He's
for
always
sure.
been in your corner, brother Paul.
Yes, he
And the other
has.
thing is one thing that you said, just like, you were willing, these men came to you that said that, you were willing to give them an opportunity when others didn't. That's the God we serve.
Amen.
Even at a very young age, I think you said, at the age of 16, you felt like you weren't worthy enough to, you know, uh, ask God or call out to Him. But you know what? You never did stop mattering to Him. He was after you. Even when the kid in school saw you and reported you, it could have turned into something a lot worse, right? But it didn't. And so I mean, here's how I see it is, you know, um, we serve a God that's full of grace and mercy, and because of that, we can continue to approach that throne of grace and be confident when we do it because His love. for us is great. I mean, it's so great that he sent his one and only son.
Yes, sir. I see it that, like you mentioned, that part of the skull. I I look at it that same way. That was him saving me.
Right,
From something that could have been, like you said, a lot worse.
right.
He, I was able to get out of that situation and not finish that day at school, and yeah, it definitely was a turnaround in my life too.
Amen. So let me close it out with, or do you have something else? I have a scripture, Luke 15:10. And I see this in all of us, in myself, and all of us that do acknowledge this. It says, "In the same way, I tell you, there is rejoicing in the presence of the angels of God over one sinner who repents." And when we repent of our sin or sins, you know, they rejoice. They rejoice because he knows that we grown tired, and he's willing to teach us a new way, but we have to be willing to surrender. Whatever ways we have picked up and whatever ways that, life has taught us, know this, that you don't have to be in survival mode anymore. You just have to be willing to walk with him, and stay in step with him. And, it's this testimony is just of how great our God is, and, not giving up, and then bringing your kids back into your life. And, yes, you know, thank you, brother. Thank you. This is the song before I close it out in prayer that I have, because if anything, he's a chain breaker, huh? That's the name of the song, Chain Breaker. If you've been walking the same old road for miles and miles, if you've been hearing the same old